right. Hi, everybody. Excited to be here with you all today. My name is Lauren Scott. You can find me on the internet as Dev Dame pretty much everywhere. I'm up from Chicago, or I'm down here from Chicago, Illinois, and I'm a developer at Braintree. I'm one of the chapter leads for our chapter of Railsbridge, and I'm also a poet. So if any of you here are poetry nerds, I'm reading Fern Hill, Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill at Fern Hill. That will probably mean nothing to any of you, but if it does mean something, it's like, yeah! So I have about 8 years of formal education in poetry. I got my BA in creative writing with poetry focus. And then I worked retail because, surprisingly, poet isn't a career, something I kind of overlooked for a bit. So I had to find something else to do, and programming was a really good step for me. It's something that's good for people who are logical and creative. And unlike poems, people pay you for writing code, so that was a definite plus. So before we get started, just show of hands, who here likes poetry? Say there's somebody who likes poetry. Yeah, guys, that's a really good showing. I'm excited about that. So for the rest of you in the room, or people who just like aren't that used to poems, let's do a quick rundown. We're gonna get a little bit of the language out of the way in terms of like terms we're gonna use. So first, we got the poem. This poem is actually called The Poem by George Oppen. It's a poetry of the meaning of words and a bond with the universe. I think there is no light in the world but the world, and I think there is light. So, obviously, full unit, we got the poem. Let's break it down, though. Then, we've got the line. The line is sort of like what the sentence is to prose, the line is to poetry. Then, there's a place where we choose to make the line break. You can think of it as your BR tag. And then we have stanzas. Stanzas are like the little kind of nuggets of poem lines that you see with the white space in between them. Then, all right, let's talk a little bit about one more important distinction. We've got form poems and free verse. And this is going to come up a lot today. So form poetry, you can think of, you guys might know, like sonnets, limericks, haikus. These are poems that have sort of a set structure, a set pattern. And they might have different constraints. Some of them have rhyming. Some of them have different meters or lengths or repetitions. And then there's free verse. And free verse is sort of anything that isn't form poetry. So free verse has no constraints. No rhymes are required. Most of the poetry that people write today is free verse. Now, it's not that free verse doesn't have things in it, like rhyme and meter, and it doesn't pay attention to those things, but their structure is not predetermined. And poetry, one more thing about it, it's not as stuffy as you think. So I know a lot of people, especially given the way that poetry tends to be taught in schools today, a lot of you are probably thinking like, oh, it's antiquated, it's not useful, it's a relic of the past, or it's like not descriptive of us, right? But that doesn't have to be the case. Now, there's a type of poetry that I kind of call like bluebird poetry. You know, it's talking about all these fanciful things. And you don't have to like bluebird poetry in order to like poetry. I get bored with that stuff too. So just to kick this off, I'm going to read a short poem by Dennis Johnson. It's called Heat, and fairly modern. I think this was in the 70s or something. It's good. It's good stuff. All right, Heat. Here in the electric dusk, your naked lover tips the glass high and the ice cubes fall against her teeth. It's beautiful Susan, her hair sticky with gin, Our Lady of wet glass rings on the album cover, streaming with hatred in the heat as the record falls and the snake band chords begin to break like terrible news from the Rolling Stones, and such a last light, full of spheres and zones. August, you're just an erotic hallucination, just so much feverishly produced kazoo music. Are you serious? This large oven impersonating night, this exhaustion mutilated to resemble passion. the bogus moon of tenderness and magic you hold out to each prisoner like a cup of light. So like, no bluebirds, right? And if you still think that this is stuffy, there is definitely poetry out there for you that is a lot harder than that, and not something that's tech presentation friendly. Okay, so we've talked a bit about poetry. Let's start getting into its things that it shares in common with programming. So you might have already noticed, like, what I think is like the biggest, most obvious connection: language, right? So both poetry and programming, they're creating meaning from language. Language is sort of like the creative medium. And when I say creative, I don't necessarily mean like it's going to be as like your code will be as creative as like a poem or a piece of art or like a dance. I mean, like we are creating something new with our medium. And with that, with language, there comes syntax. So there's this great Oscar Wilde quote: "I've spent most of the day putting in a comma and the rest of the day taking it out," which like sounds pretty familiar, right? So in poetry too, like there can be just like it's like a single piece of punctuation that completely changes meaning. So there has to be this like huge attention to detail. You have to be making sure that everything is the exact right thing to use at that moment. So like, okay, there's the Oxford comma, for example. So the Oxford comma is like if you've got like a list of 3 things, it's the comma that you put before the and. People think of it as optional. I think Oxford commas are pretty important. So here we have an example with the comma, the Oxford comma. We invited the rhinoceri, Washington and Lincoln. But without the Oxford comma, we invited the rhinoceri, Washington and Lincoln. So syntax can really change everything. I mean, this example is just concerning grammatical rules, and in poetry you don't always have to be grammatically correct. But the way that you use syntax and the way that you put your words together, that means something. So every decision that you make regarding that, it really changes the reader's impression of the poem. So like if you don't want the poem's voice to be formal or authoritative, you might be like, okay, I'm not going to use capital letters. I'm not going to use all the punctuation. If you want it to be like, if you want it to have kind of like anxiety in the poem or a sense of like unease, you might say, okay, I'm going to do lots of run-on sentences, or I'm going to do like line break in unexpected places. Then we have white space. So white space is just the negative space that surrounds your words. Now this can have like a huge effect on poetry as well. The same words with different white space can kind of mean different things to the reader. And as a programmer, like one of the very first things that you learn when you're learning code is how to properly indent stuff, because otherwise nobody's gonna understand what you're writing. And in some cases, right, it's the key to the computer understanding what you're writing as well. So in both fields, you kind of have to develop this gut response to how things look. Like, you know, I'm sure we all can relate to like looking at some Ruby code and just seeing, just based off of the white space without reading anything else, you're like, ooh, that method is way too long, or like something's definitely off here. If you need more convincing that white space is important, like, okay, minified HTML. No, none of us know what's going on here. This is madness. The white space is what allows us to enter the code and understand it. And one of the very first similarities that I noticed when I started learning how to program was how often code and poetry sort of visually mirror each other. So what I have here is, here's some of the source code from Rails and a Sylvia Plath poem. I blurred them out, so we're not just focusing on that, 'cause Sylvia Plath always steals the show. But you can see how like the stanzas in that Plath poem, they look a lot like the methods in Rails, right? And much like those methods, these stanzas are separated by that white space in order to separate thought. Now, if we look at like this E.E. Cummings poem, on the other hand, so you can tell based off of this poem is probably going to be a lot different than that poem on the right? Just based off of that white space, there are different feelings, and there's a different mood that is automatically conveyed. Now, in both of these forms, you have something that you are trying to communicate with the reader, and you're trying to communicate that through language. And the reader is going to, you know, it can be a human, it can be a computer, A poem has an expected output, much like a program does. So it aims for something. It can aim for conveying an emotion or an idea or giving a feeling to the reader. And you can kind of think of it as a program. So like a reader enters the poem, and we want the poem to change them by the time that they've exited. So it's like a destructive method, you know? And both of these forms are also striving for brevity, hence the condensed. So you're trying to say the most that you can. You're trying to get all of the functionality of that program, all of the functionality of the poem, the least amount of words. So that's yet another example of the constraints that we have. So poetry and code are really about creativity within those constraints. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest types of constraints in poetry is, if you choose to use it, form poetry. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that, and we're going to go over sonnets. For those of you who care, we're talking about Elizabethan sonnets today, not Petrarchan sonnets. Big difference. But let's run down what makes a sonnet a sonnet. Okay. So first things first, 14 lines long. Awesome, easy, done. So this is composed. Okay, now we're going to break it down. It's going to be composed first off of 3 quatrains. Now quatrains are stanzas that have 4 lines, hence the quatrain. Then there's something in the poem that it's not like a physical thing in the poem. It's not like oh, we're going to put in this line, but it's more of a logical thing. It's called the Volta. And the Volta is supposed to sort of happen at the end of these 3 quatrains. Now the quatrains, you're going to be building up an argument in your sonnet. So you are slowly working towards something, and then comes a point where you twist it. You make a logical turn, and then we end up with these last 2 couplets, or 2 lines in the last couplet. So a couplet is a 2-line stanza. Now, all of this has to be an iambic pentameter, which an iamb is a metrical foot that goes ba-dum. It's that rhythm. And pentameter means that there are going to be 5 pent of these iambs in your line. So it sounds like da-dum, 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 da-dum. So tons of examples in this in Shakespeare. If you've ever read Shakespeare, you have read iambic pentameter. He just uses it constantly. I think a great example of this is, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. And then we have the rhyme scheme. So the rhyme scheme, you can see here I've laid it out actually with the end words of the sonnet we're about to look at. So you can see it says A, B, A, B, in which case the A's rhyme with each other and the B's rhyme with each other. This is the word that you have at the end of your lines. So we've got this whole different rhyme scheme that we've got going on for the whole thing. All right, so we got a lot of things. We've heard a lot about sonnets. Let's take a look at a sonnet. We're going to take a look at Shakespeare, who actually really wasn't that great at writing sonnets. His sonnets aren't very fantastic, but I really like this particular one. I think it's a good example of a sonnet. So pay attention to the logical progression of this poem. Keep your eyes out for that Volta. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet, well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So you can really see how this form is working for Shakespeare in this case, right? So in these first 3 stanzas, he's building up this argument about like how imperfect his mistress is. Like it's totally a dick move. He is like negging her really hard, what he's doing is he's riffing off all of these love poems, these flowery love poems at the time that were like, oh, my girlfriend has hair like the sun. It's like, I don't know, she's just a human. I'm not gonna say that like, oh, this is the most beautiful pair of eyes I've ever seen. Like she's a human woman, and that's fine. But then he's saying like at the end like, but actually I think that because I'm not like idealizing her and idolizing her, because I'm not like putting her on that pedestal and comparing her to these grandiose things, like that love is more genuine than the kind of love that does do that. So you can see like, all right, it's doing something here. A lot goes into the sonnet. Like he had to get all of those things together into this form. So much goes into there, and it has to be good, which is crazy. I mean, it is really hard trying to fit what you want to say into this form. And like if you think this is hard, this is a pretty simple form. So like, for example, I mean, there are tons of different forms with tons of different kinds of constraints, but like there's something called a heroic crown of sonnets. So it's one poem, but the poem is made up of 14 sonnets in a row, and then one more sonnet that is made up of the first lines of all of those 14 sonnets in the order that they came into the poem, right? And like that has to actually mean something. It's crazy. And sometimes that can be like really, really frustrating, right? And you can hate the form for keeping you back. But there's a reason that we have these forms. And these things originated in form poetry for really specific reasons. I mean, particularly, so when we look back to why forms sort of happened, so they happened to make things easier to memorize in a time when like literary knowledge was an oral tradition, and memorization, that was how things survived. And these forms, they helped people feel the poetry and understand it and remember it. And they were developed and they've stuck around for so long because they give helpful guidelines to make these things happen. They set you up with a structure that works. So forms help you do things like organize thought, pay attention to sound, develop patterns, develop rhythms. Sometimes the most important thing that they help you do is just like actually get started, because it's difficult sometimes to get started on making something. And each form brings a different set of tools to the table. They help you do all kinds of different things with your poem. So the form is there to help you. Plus, challenges are fun. Okay, so I know this is a really overused meme, but I put this in here because this is so particularly reflective of how I felt when I was like a teenager and I like discovered sonnets. Because I was like, yeah, I am going to sonnet all the things. I turned everything into a sonnet. I did my college entrance essays in iambic pentameter in quatrains with end rhyme. Like, it was unnecessary. And I just kept putting all of these things into sonnet form that should not have been sonnets. Like, there are things that didn't work with the whole, like, logical progression and the Volta. There are things that just, like, it made no sense. I was just like, yeah, I want to do this. It sounds like fun. And you know, it's easy to get caught up in those low-level challenges, right? Like trying to make your thought fit the meter and the rhyme scheme, either because it's really fun to you or because like it's just frustrating and you just like need to get it, like you need to make it work. But you can get so caught up in that you forget the high-level challenges. Like, should I be using this form? And does it help this particular poem or idea? So again, this might sound familiar, right? Form poetry is really similar to some of our tools in programming, like frameworks, languages, design patterns, you know, ABAB, MVC. And I'm sure that we've all had times where we find that we are really struggling against the form that we've chosen to write in. So you might be tempted to change so many of the low-level things to get your idea to fit into there that you start to lose all of the positive things that the form is created to give it was made to provide for you, right? So you need to get into the practice of asking yourself, is this the right form? Now, it's totally okay to not like always follow every last rule. You can break conventions sometimes. But if you find that you're trying to break like every convention or you're trying to change everything, particularly the more high-level structures or benefits of the thing that you're working in. Now, like, what good is it doing you? And like, would a different form be better? Would it be more beneficial? So you have to trust yourself enough to make changes, but know how to recognize the red flags of when you've changed too much or when you're pushing that hard back against it. Whoops, all right. Oh, there we go. Yes, it's working. Last time this didn't work, I'm very pumped. Okay, so then what? So, cool, you got your form, you go free verse, whatever, you pick a language, pick a framework, you get to writing. But then we got a whole nother problem that we're running into, right? And that is what makes code and poetry good. Like, yeah, this is a real great question to bring up. We're like, what makes code good? Well, I'm just gonna answer that right now and we're all gonna be done. I'm just gonna walk right out of here. But really, what's difficult about this is that like both of these things are subjective, right? So like, there's not necessarily an objective way to write the best code. And everybody has opinions about it. So everybody in this room probably has pretty different opinions about like what they think is the best way to even approach, like if we're all approaching the same problem, we're gonna have different opinions on it, right? And when it comes down to it, it is hard to teach something that is going to change so much based off of the context. It's contextual creation that is particularly difficult to teach. Because so much is going to change. Like we can't tell people one rule that helps them write the best poem every time. You have to look within the context that you're working in. And so we have plenty of guidelines, though, that are there to help us along the way. And one of the main guidelines that I think applies to both is to say a lot with a little. So you want to use just enough language to make yourself clear, because in both fields, people like it when things are concise, right? You want to make sure every word is necessary. Now, one thing I ask myself a lot when I'm writing a poem is like, if I'm putting in a word, I think, okay, what did this word add? Like, what have I gained by putting it in, and what would I lose if I took it out? Is it actually adding something necessary? And that's a really good question, but we have to think first, well, like, what makes something necessary? How do we decide what that means? And today I'm going to talk about it in terms of a balance of two factors, fact and beauty. So by fact, I mean sort of the functionality or the message. So what the code does or what the poetry means. It's what you say. And then there's beauty, sort of the clarity of the code, or the readability, or the poemy parts of the poem, like the imagery. And we're all Rubyists here, so I'm making the assumption that readable code is something that we're all striving for. But yeah, basically this is how you say things. So we're gonna take a look at a poem that's really, really famous for saying a lot with a little. In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound. The apparition of these faces in the crowd petals on a wet black bough. Now Pound is able to convey this huge amount of feeling in just 2 lines, right? So I mean, this is pretty much the favorite small poem of every single English major out there. People love this. I know like 5 people who have this tattooed on them in some way, shape, or like people are really into it. And like, so why? Why is this working so well for Pound here? What's so important about this balance? Well, without the beauty, the fact can be irrelevant. So a poem that tells you exactly what it's about, it might be clear, but it sort of loses its magic. And a line of code that like is very, you know, it really works. It might be chained 15 methods long on one line and nobody can read it, and your coworkers are gonna read it and try and read it and they're not gonna know what's happening and they're gonna hate you. It can be very difficult and even painful, a lot like bad poetry. But so like, what if Pound had gone too far in sort of stripping down the essence of his poem? You could end up with something like this. I was in the metro by Ezra, just the facts, Pound. I saw faces in the crowd, they were beautiful. Okay, not only is this kind of a lame poem, but it's also losing some of the meaning that it had before, right? So we don't get the full richness of the poem. We lose a lot of the extra things that it was conveying with its imagery, with the beauty of it. And you can think of imagery kind of like imagery and metaphor, they're like variables or methods, right? So you're saying one thing and you're referring to like a whole different thing that more information, like you're referencing one thing to get that other information. So by itself, like a method might not tell that much of a story, but in the context of your code, it can make sense, it can come alive. But too much elaboration loses focus. So if you go on and on with imagery and flowery words, you can dilute the message that your poem has. Just like if you're adding unnecessary comments or really breaking your code up way too much in order to make it readable, it can actually kind of end up going in the opposite direction, making it less readable and just harder to get to the message of what you're actually trying to say. So if Pound hadn't only said what he needed to, we could have ended up with something like this. In a dreary station of the metro, by Ezra Pilot on Pound. I was deep down in the metro looking at the crowd, and these faces appeared almost as if they were ghosts. The metro was a dark cavern, the crowd a solid mass, but the faces were clear, delicate, fleeting, a brief moment of beauty in the otherwise dark world, like flower petals stuck to a slick black bough wet with rain. Okay, way less impactful, right? I mean, poetry also follows the rule of don't repeat yourself, right? You gotta be dry. You say it once and you say it well, so you do not have to say it again. You want to use the methods and the variables that are available to you. So Pound didn't have to go on about how he felt when he saw those faces in the crowd because he used the libraries available to him, like the knowledge that we all share from experiencing life as human beings. And he said it was like petals on a wet black bough, and that holds the rest of the information that we need to understand it. So remember the human aspect. Ultimately, if you work with other developers especially, your code is not meant to just be consumed by the computer, it is also consumed by people. And if you forgo like readability, you cut people out of the equation. So you're not writing poems, you're just journaling. And maybe try approaching your code with that question that I asked myself about my poetry. So is each word necessary? Is there something that's not being said? And remember that readability can be just as necessary as function. So now that we've talked about some of the challenges in writing these things, there's another question, and that's teaching. So how do we teach the contextual? And a lot of these guidelines that we're talking about are fairly dependent on making gut decisions. I mean, it can be really difficult to make or to teach people to make the best decisions based off context or to agree what they are when you have the context. But let's take a look at at how poetry is taught, see what we might be able to steal from them. So, workshops. Poetry is usually, if you're writing poetry, you're learning poetry, you're gonna be in a lot of these workshops. And they're basically gonna be little classes with like small number of people, maybe like 8. And they rely a lot on giving feedback to each other. So when it's your turn to be workshopped, you send your poem or poems off with your classmates. They're gonna go read it, mark it up, write critiques. Everybody reconvenes, you read your work out loud to the class, but then this is where it gets really terrifying. You have to be quiet. Like, you're not allowed to talk for the whole first part of the conversation. And by the first part of the discussion, I mean like, that's almost the entire discussion. For most of it, you just sit there, and everybody, all of your classmates, they just sit there, they critique your poems. And they will not always get it right. In fact, they will get it disastrously wrong, and they will have like long conversations about things that like you definitely didn't mean, and they're all like debating it, and you're like, oh my God, no. So it's like so hard to stay quiet, right? But and eventually you can reply. You can talk to them about these things. But by not being able to reply for a lot of it, you are given a gift. And that gift is that you know what your poem says when it speaks for itself. Because you will not always be there. Like when your poem is out in a literary book or a journal, you're not going to be able to defend it there. You can't give you can't give your readers that missing piece of information like you could do at the end of your workshop where you're like, well, actually it was like this, and they're like, oh, okay, I get it. You don't have that. So even if you don't agree with the critique that people give you in a workshop, which you often won't, it still gives you valuable information. How people react to your work as it stands by itself and not as it stands explained by you. So with programming, bug comes up, maybe you move to the next job, maybe you're on vacation, maybe you wrote this thing a year ago and you have absolutely no recollection of writing this thing, of why you wrote things in a certain way. You're looking back at it and you're like, yes, I definitely wrote this, but I don't know what it is. So you can't rely on yourself to explain it. So I recommend to try being silent. And this is difficult, right? It's difficult even for me. I find myself wanting to explain my decisions all of the time. And I think it comes out of this fear, right? It's a fear that people are going to misunderstand you. They're going to think you don't know the things that you do. But if your code isn't speaking for itself, staying silent and listening is valuable. You can explain yourself later, but allow yourself a moment to get the feedback. And you might hear actionable pieces of information you might not have heard otherwise. Which brings me to my last point, revision. So it's easy to get attached to the things that we make, right? So it's easy for things to get precious. This was one of my hardest things as a poet is thinking, and to overcome thinking of my poems as precious. Because when you put a lot of yourself into a creative process, you get proud of what you're accomplished. It can be very hard to change it. So like our poems or our code, they're like our children, by which I mean we refuse to think that anything they do is other than perfect. We love and accept them as they are, which is great for children and horrible for poetry and code. Because when we think this way, when we let them become precious, when we care about them so much that we cannot change them, our work stagnates. We do not get better. So what I'm suggesting, is to kill what you love. Not always. You don't have to completely gut it, but you have to be ready and willing to destroy things that are precious to you. Because you don't know when your feature is going to be canceled, right? You don't know when they're going to use code that your coworker wrote instead, or maybe even if you just get feedback that allows you to change what you wrote and make it better and allows you to grow. And it helps if you remember that you are not what you make. The more that you conflate yourself with the things that you produce, the harder it's going to be when you have to change them. So remember that although you put a lot of yourself into what you do, your work isn't you. And changing or destroying your work, it's not a sign of personal defeat. I mean, the majority of the most famous poems that are out there, they've went through countless revisions, or as we'd say, refactors. You can find early drafts of a lot of famous poems, and they look absolutely nothing like the things that they ended up being. So if these poets had kept their work precious, they never would have achieved the things that they did. They would have lost out on these moments of beauty. So, yeah, remember, it's kind of like a prairie fire, right? Like you have to burn shit down sometimes in order to keep growing. So keep yourself open. All right. Thank you all for listening to me. Do we have any questions? No? Okay, just in case we didn't have any questions, I did put one more thing, and it's just like the secret extra bonus slides, just because it's really fun. I think you're all going to appreciate this. So, okay, I am not the first person who's really talked about code and poetry together. There's this great book called Code Poems. So it was a project by some programmers back in 2012, and they noticed the similarities between these two things, and they got a bunch of programmers together and gathered poems by them and also from artists, and they're all written in programming languages. So it's poetry written in code. The programs don't have to do anything, but they have to be like valid, compilable code. The book is only available in one place, at the Contemporary Culture Center in Barcelona, but you can buy it on their website, and you should totally get it. As they say about this, they say, code can speak literature, logic, maths. It contains different layers of abstraction and links them to the physical world of processors and memory chips. All these resources can contribute in expanding the boundaries of contemporary poetry by using code as a new language. Code to speak about life or death, love or hate. Code meant to be read, not run. And so I went to Barcelona and I got this, I went to the place and I got the book. It was like the nerdiest pilgrimage ever. And I was reading one of the poems, and it actually, you guys, it made me cry. I was like reading it outside in a park in Barcelona, and I was like, wow, this is ridiculous. But I took a picture of it, and I wanted to share it with you all. It's called For Agnes. For you, Agnes, in which time, do find if you can, there is nothing, Agnes, to be done until you know. Do you know who am I? Look, my Agnes, if you only could, then I'd rejoice. Patch false hopes, from nothing to nothing, done, done. Less zero, say V, Agnes. All right, there you go. Any questions pop up between them? Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.